I've always hated these keys. Small, metal reminders of the people who moved here and are trying to ruin my life. Today it finally ends. I'm standing in the hallway, looking at the bunch of keys that slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor. They clinked against the tiles, and when I bent down to pick them up, I noticed something strange. One of the keys had blood on it, a small, dark red drop, already dried. I looked closer but just smirked. Who the hell cares? Here in this miserable neighborhood, blood is not uncommon. You never know what might happen when you walk down the street. And that Black Harris family, in their case, it was only a matter of time before they messed up. I had long wanted to get rid of them. My gut told me these people would bring trouble. But today I will finally get some peace. I nervously rub my hands, feeling the cold metal of the keys transferring to my fingers. A smile slowly spreads across my face. Now, I'll get rid of these people, and I can finally breathe easy. I can already imagine the Harrises packing up their belongings, citing a breach of the rental agreement. Let them go wherever they want. I don't care. The only thing that matters is that I won't have to deal with their presence anymore. But something feels strange in the air today. A vague sense of unease. Maybe it's just nerves, or maybe it's something more. But I'm not going to let my thoughts go too far. The important thing is to take the step I've planned. Evict the Harrises. Put an end to it. When the Harrises opened the door, I was already standing there with a self-important look, arms crossed over my chest. My suit was pressed, and a smug smile was plastered on my face. They looked at me with surprise, or perhaps with a pitiful fear that I had always loved seeing in others' eyes. "Mr. Harris," I began, holding an official notice in my hands. "Unfortunately, you have violated the terms of the rental agreement. I'm forced to ask you to vacate the premises. You have 3 days. The head of the family tried to say something. His wife quietly sobbed in the background, and the children looked on in confusion. But I didn't care. I just nodded at the paper in his hands and added, "It's all there. Breach of contract. Sadly, the law is the law." He stood there, as if paralyzed, staring at me, not knowing what to say. His gaze reminded me of a weak beam of light trying to break through the darkness. But darkness always wins, doesn't it? I felt a surge of pleasure from the power I held over them. "You'll understand everything when you read the notice," I added, and turned sharply, feeling my shoes clatter against the stair with each step. When I stepped outside, the evening sun gently lit the neighborhood, and I suddenly realized that the anxiety that had been bothering me was gone. I had won. They would leave, and that would be the end of it. But then I noticed something strange. The Harrises were already packing their things, as if they knew this would happen. And the strangest thing was the smiles on their faces, as if they were glad to leave, glad that I was evicting them. I watched their car as they drove away, but when I saw where they were moving, a knot tightened inside me. The next neighborhood over, and the houses there, were too identical. And so were the residents. Their faces were strange, as if drawn from the same template. The Harrises moved into that house, and they were greeted with smiles that, to me, seemed too tense, too cheerful. Something isn't right, and I don't like it. Night came suddenly. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in bed, still thinking about those smiles from the Harrises and their new neighbors. They were too friendly, too similar. I decided to go over there and see what was going on in that house, just to take a look. When I got to the house where the Harrises had moved in, the lights were on, and I heard muffled sounds of conversation and laughter. I slipped into the darkness, sneaking closer, and froze when I saw what was happening inside. The Harrises' neighbors were sitting around a large table. Their faces were cold, and their eyes burned with a strange, chilling light. They were talking about some kind of sacrifice, examining carved knives, and eagerly discussing the details. But suddenly, as if on cue, they fell silent, and all their heads turned toward me. My feet pounded against the ground. I stepped back, and their voices cut through the silence. "Welcome, our new neighbor." Laughter exploded in my head. I ran, not knowing where I was going, and soon realized there was nowhere to run. All around were the same houses, the same faces staring at me from the windows. My feet led me to a garbage bin. There, trembling with fear, I tried to hide. But suddenly, a wave of foul food scraps poured over me, and a neighbor's cat jumped onto my head, scratching my bald scalp. "Damn it! What the hell is going on here?" I shouted, trying to fend off the cat, but it just purred arrogantly, as if pleased. I finally realized that I was trapped, with no way out. In this neighborhood, among these people, I had become part of something terrifying and incomprehensible. Something invisible but powerful now controlled everything around me, and all I could do was desperately fight for my life or lose it in this madness. Chapter 1. Waking up in the unknown. I woke up on a cold floor, and the first thing I noticed was the horrible sensation of sticky sweat covering my body. My shirt clung to my back, and a dull ache throbbed in my head. I didn't immediately realize where I was. The room around me was strange. It seemed like my apartment, but everything felt out of place. The pictures on the walls had changed, the furniture was arranged differently, and the light streamed through the windows at a different angle than I was used to. This isn't my apartment, but it is. I tried to remember how I ended up here, but my mind was blank. Yesterday, or was it last night, was a blur. All I felt was a strange pain in the back of my head, as if someone had hit me with something heavy. I got to my feet, holding onto the wall, and walked to the mirror hanging in the hallway. My face looked battered, my eyes bloodshot, and my cheeks sunken, but it was still me. The same Thomas Randall, the successful landlord who controls everything around him. Or used to. I needed to get these foolish thoughts out of my head. This is just a dream, a fleeting nightmare that will leave no trace. I started breathing deeply, trying to convince myself of this. I needed to get back to my usual routine. Today, I had another eviction on the agenda. Another black family behind on their payments. That's what really matters. With these thoughts, I pulled myself together and headed out, assuring myself that everything was fine. I walked down the street, heading to the office, but something inside still felt off. Every step echoed, as if I were walking through emptiness. I decided to stop by a store to buy cigarettes and suddenly noticed them, those same neighbors of the Harrises. They stood by the shop window, smiling as if they had accidentally bumped into me. Their faces once again seemed too identical, and their smiles too wide. "Hello, Thomas," said one of them, a tall man with a shiny bald head. "Long time no see. How's everything? All good?" I nervously nodded, trying not to make too much of their presence. I must be overworked, and this is all just in my head. But as I tried to walk past, another neighbor suddenly added, "Next time, you'll be with us, Thomas." His words made me stop mid-step. What did he mean? I turned to ask, but they were already gone, as if they had dissolved into the crowd. The sense of unreality grew stronger. I continued on my way to the home of the next family I was going to evict, trying to push the strange thoughts out of my mind. I needed to focus on my task, but all day, I kept seeing them, the Harris's neighbors, in the most unexpected places. At the gas station, on the street corner, even in the lobby of my building, they all smiled and looked at me as if they knew something I didn't. When I got home that evening, their words still echoed in my mind. "Next time, you'll be with us, Thomas." I locked the door behind me and tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. but it didn't make me feel any better. I was about to go to bed when I suddenly noticed that something in my apartment had changed. A sharp smell hit my nose, and I went to the kitchen, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The furniture. It wasn't my furniture. There was an old wooden table with curved legs in the kitchen, which I certainly never bought. I walked through the entire apartment and realized that everything around me now looked just like the Harris's house. The walls were painted a different color. Photos of strangers hung where mine used to be, and even the bed linens were different, cheap, not mine. I rushed to the mirror in the hallway and froze in horror. The face staring back at me was no longer mine. It was someone else's. The features were too perfect, the skin too smooth, and the eyes were foreign, empty, lifeless, just like the Harris's neighbors. "No," I screamed, grabbing my head. "This isn't me. It can't be me." I grabbed a chair and tried to smash the mirror, but it only cracked, reflecting countless copies of my new, horrifying face. Panicked, I started throwing furniture out the window, but each time I returned to the room, everything was back in its place. And each time, there was more of it. Blankets, chairs, tables. They multiplied, filling the apartment to the brim. I screamed at the carpet, trying to tear it off the floor, but it seemed glued down and wouldn't budge. It felt alive, resisting as if mocking me. I furiously kicked it until I collapsed on the floor, choking on despair. Everything around me moved, changed, became foreign, and I was simply losing myself in this nightmare. I was invited to a tenants meeting. Normally, I ignore such events. I don't see the point in wasting time on empty discussions about roof repairs or fixing the entrance. But there was something odd about this invitation. It came from the new neighbors of the Harrises, the ones who always seemed overly friendly. The letter was neatly folded with "For Mr. Randall only" written on the envelope. I couldn't resist my curiosity and decided to go. I knew something was off. The people living in that house were just too strange, too welcoming. Lately, I felt like they've been watching me, like predators eyeing their prey. But this time, I felt I might break free from this cycle. The tenants' meeting was the perfect opportunity to find out what was really going on. As I approached the house, I noticed the lights on in the windows, and muffled voices came from behind the door. The smell of roasted meat hung in the air, and I felt my stomach tighten with hunger. I stepped inside, and one of the neighbors immediately greeted me with a smile. "Welcome, Mr. Randall. Please, have a seat. We've been expecting you." I nodded and walked into the living room, where a few people had gathered. Their faces were familiar, but not quite. They all resembled people I once knew. Maybe some former tenants. Soon I realized this wouldn't be just any meeting, and something inside me began to flutter with unease. The meeting started off strangely. Instead of discussing the usual mundane issues typical of such gatherings, everyone began talking about food, about what kind of meat tastes best, how to cook it, what spices to use. This immediately put me on edge. I looked at the other tenants. They seemed engrossed in the conversation, their eyes glowing with a strange enthusiasm. "And what kind of meat do you like, Mr. Randall?" one of the neighbors asked. The same one I'd run into at the store. I felt a chill run through me. Something wasn't right. I wanted to leave, but my legs felt glued to the floor. I smiled, trying to hide my anxiety. I'm not much of an expert, but probably beef," I replied, feeling the words stick in my throat. The neighbors exchanged glances and laughed, as if I had said something incredibly funny. "You just haven't tried our meat yet," one of them said, smiling in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. The conversation continued, and I began to realize that these people were not just neighbors. They spoke of things only those I had evicted in the past would know. The words, the tone, even their mannerisms. It all reminded me of the unfortunate souls I'd thrown out onto the street. But how could this be? My mind was no longer clear. I needed to do something to regain control. I decided I had to do whatever it took to become the leader among them. If I could become the head, I could control the neighborhood and reclaim my power. The next day, I decided to invite all these strange neighbors to a dinner party. I was confident that I could outsmart them, become a sort of leader to them, and then make them play by my rules. I prepared everything perfectly, the finest wines, exquisite dishes, even went out of my way to create a cozy atmosphere in the house. But deep down, I still couldn't shake the anxiety. When everyone arrived, I felt the control slipping away from me. The conversations flowed smoothly, but there was something off about them. People began tearing into the food with a kind of animalistic greed, finding strange things inside. In one chicken leg, someone found fingers. In another, a human eye. I tried to hide my horror, but I couldn't look away. Everyone around me laughed, pointing at these discoveries as if it were the most normal thing in the world. One of the guests held up a piece of meat that clearly wasn't part of the dish and said, with a satisfied smile, "Look, this looks like a liver. I think Mr. Randall will be next." I felt the ground disappear beneath me. This was madness, pure and unfiltered. I tried to stand up to make a toast, but the glass in my hand suddenly cracked, spilling red wine all over me. It looked so much like blood that one of the guests, smiling, said, "Excellent choice, Mr. Randall. Blood is always better than wine." At that moment, I realized they had been toying with me all along, and I had become part of their horrific game. They had trapped me in this house, in this neighborhood, in this madness, and there was no way out. I was surrounded by monsters, wearing human masks. And now, my life depended on their mood. I couldn't stay in that cursed place any longer. The smiling neighbors, their strange manners, the constant mocking. It was driving me insane. I felt the air around me growing heavier with each passing day. I knew I had to escape before it was too late, leave everything behind and drive so far away that I would never see these people again. I packed up the essentials, threw my things into the car, and hit the road. My legs were trembling, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The road stretched into the darkness, and I hoped that somewhere beyond it, I could find a place to start over. But as soon as I had driven a few blocks, I sensed something was wrong. The radio, which I had turned on to distract myself, suddenly started playing the same song over and over, like a stuck record. I fiddled with the tuning knob, but nothing changed. The melody wouldn't stop. When I saw the familiar sign ahead and the same house where I had started my journey, my heart sank. I was back on the same street, in the same neighborhood. I turned the car around and drove in the opposite direction. But after a few minutes, I found myself in the exact same spot. The roads were looped, like a trap with no exit. I couldn't believe my eyes. Every time I thought I was taking a new route, it led me back. The feeling of panic grew. I decided to drive faster, not letting up on the gas until the fuel started to run out. But each time, I ended up back on that same street, in that same damned neighborhood. I screamed in despair, but the only response was the quiet hum of the radio and the deafening silence. There was no way out of this town anymore. When it became clear that escaping wasn't an option, I decided I had to destroy everything that tied me to this place. If I burned down my apartment, maybe I could finally break free from this trap. I returned home, gathered all the flammable items I could find, and doused them in gasoline. The match shook in my hand as I struck it and threw it to the floor. The fire spread instantly, and I watched with a grim satisfaction as the flames grew, consuming the walls and furniture. But something went wrong. Instead of destroying the apartment, the fire began to spread to the neighboring houses. I ran outside and saw the houses around me also catching fire. It seemed that everything would burn to the ground, but to my horror, the houses began to restore themselves as if the fire had never touched them. They rose from the ashes as if nothing could destroy them. The Harrises stood on the street, staring at me with their lifeless eyes. They looked exactly like those strange neighbors I had tried to escape from. Their faces were identical, their smiles just as empty. I realized that I had become part of this nightmare, and there was no way out. I couldn't return to my apartment because it no longer belonged to me. Everything I knew, everything I thought, destroyed. I stood amidst the burning houses that were rebuilding themselves, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, I saw myself. Not exactly me, but someone identical to me, happy and smiling. He was part of the crowd that had begun a strange ritual dance. They laughed, spun around, clapped their hands, and at the center of their circle was me, the one who had now become part of their game. I rushed toward my double, screaming in desperation, but he just looked at me and laughed. The crowd surrounded me, and I could no longer resist. I started dancing with them, driven by some unknown force. The music coming from nowhere was strange and accelerating, as if everything around was speeding up. By the time I realized I was at the center of this madness, it was too late. Everyone around me laughed, and I tried to shout something, but no sound came out. They announced a dance battle, and I was the main participant. The neighbors circled me, moving to the rhythm until I was left on my knees, exhausted and humiliated. This was hell, and there was no escape. And just when I thought I couldn't endure it any longer, one of them pointed at me and said, "Your penalty round. Perform YMCA." The neighbors started singing and clapping, and I knew there was no way out of this nightmare. I was now part of their world. I opened my eyes and immediately knew something was wrong. Around me was nothing but whiteness. Blinding white walls, ceiling and floor, all merging into a single, endless backdrop that blurred before my eyes. I tried to recall where I was and how I got here, but my memory refused to cooperate. No doors, no windows, not even a shadow, just a white void. The air felt too dense, too oppressive, as if the space was closing in on me, pushing me into a corner. I stood up from the floor and noticed the only objects in this room: a mirror on the wall and a table in the center of the room. On the table lay a gun. My heart started pounding harder. Why was there a gun? Was this a trap, a game? Or was I supposed to decide what to do with it myself? I approached the mirror, hoping to see my reflection. But instead, I saw nothing. I stood in front of the mirror, but I couldn't see myself. It was as if reality had torn apart. I knew I should be reflected, but instead, there was just a blank screen staring back at me. Inside, everything flipped upside down, and fear began to creep over my skin like icy fingers. What does this mean? Why am I here? Thoughts raced chaotically through my mind as despair filled me from within. But one thing was clear. I had to get out of here, no matter the cost. Hours, maybe days passed. It was impossible to tell how time flowed here. I sat on the floor, staring at the mirror and the table with the gun. The silence was suffocating, as if something was waiting for me to make the first move. But what to do? Thoughts swirled in my head, only making things worse. Neighbors, laughter, endless rooms. This hell. It all blurred into one big mess. I thought I was already losing my mind when I heard a whisper. The mirror flickered, and one of those neighbors appeared before me. He looked the same as before, but his eyes gleamed with unnatural joy. His mouth stretched into a grin as he spoke. "Hello, Thomas. How do you like it here in our new room?" "What do you want from me?" I shouted, trembling with anger and fear. "What is this place?" He didn't answer directly, just stood there, smiling at me. After a minute, his face changed. It was now another neighbor, with the same sinister smile. With each change of appearance, I felt reality slipping further away. They were toying with me, teasing, confusing me. Every time I tried to ask what they wanted, they just switched faces. But the words remained the same, repeating over and over. You brought us here, Thomas. Remember, we're here because of you. Each time, I felt my sanity breaking under the weight of those words. Were they right? No, it couldn't be true. I had to get out of here. The gun on the table seemed like the only answer. Maybe if I ended it all now, it would stop. I picked up the gun, pointed it at myself, and damn it, everything disappeared. I was back in my apartment, surrounded by the laughter of the neighbors, who stood at the doors and windows, watching me like a circus clown. This cycle repeated over and over. I tried to shoot myself, but each time I returned to this room or to my apartment, which was no longer my home, each time it was a new loop of madness. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. The neighbors kept coming through the mirror, changing their faces, taunting me, mocking me. I knew I had to do something different. I picked up the gun again, but this time, I aimed it at the mirror. I thought that maybe, by destroying the mirror, I could break this vicious cycle. I pulled the trigger, and the mirror shattered into thousands of pieces. Instead of a reflection, I saw a black void, which began sucking everything around it. The air pulled me toward the void like a giant vacuum, and I knew I could no longer resist. In the last moment, just before the darkness consumed me, I saw the reflection of the Harrises in one of the remaining shards of the mirror. They were laughing, pointing at me as if I were some fool who had finally realized that it was all an illusion. And as I fell into the abyss, their laughter echoed in my ears, followed by a loud shout, "Don't forget to pay the rent, Thomas." And that was the last sound I heard as I plunged into absolute darkness. I'm exhausted, completely drained. This nightmare, this endless loop, it's all far beyond reason now. I no longer know where reality ends and madness begins. All I feel is absolute despair and the unwavering certainty that if I don't carry out some final act, I'll be stuck here forever, trapped in this hellish cycle. In front of me lies a contract. The paper looks ancient, almost archaic, with yellowed edges and old-fashioned lettering. I understand that this isn't just a document. It's my path to freedom. I have to sign it, and maybe then this horror will end. But when I try to use my blood instead of ink, it disappears, leaving no trace. It's absurd. It's a curse. My own body refuses to give me an escape. It feels like the universe itself is mocking me, ridiculing every step I take. As I sit before this contract, images of all those I once humiliated and evicted flash through my mind. I see their faces, hear their screams, and it all seeps into me like poison. I realize this isn't just a nightmare. It's retribution. And yet, I can't accept it. I have to find a way out. But how? I wander through the apartment, which is either mine or not. Everything here seems strangely familiar, yet distorted. I see myself in every corner. Not a reflection, but the old Thomas, who I used to be. Suddenly, I relive my most despicable deeds. I see myself evicting a family with small children onto the street in the rain, hearing them beg for mercy. But I'm ruthless. I see myself tormenting elderly tenants just because I didn't like the color of their skin. But it all happens in a twisted way. The faces of the people turn into grotesque masks. Their bodies distort beyond recognition. They laugh at my actions, mock my cruelty. These aren't just memories. They're a caricature of myself, as if someone is showing me how pathetic and insignificant I really am. And just when I can't bear the madness any longer, I see a figure. It's me, but not the me I know. This me looks happy, calm, smiling, but the smile is sinister. He approaches and says, "You can't leave, Thomas. You created this place. We're all your creations. Want to end it? Then finish what you started." I feel something click inside me. I now understand that the only way out is to sign that damned contract. But how? My blood disappears. That means I need something else, or someone else. I sit before the contract again, but now I know what to do. If my blood isn't enough, I'll use someone else's. One thought surfaces in my mind: the Harrises. They were the last straw in my downfall. If I sign the contract with their name, maybe I'll finally be free. I take the pen, dip it in blood that isn't mine, and write their name. The paper absorbs the blood, and the contract begins to shimmer. But something goes wrong. Everything around me starts to crumble. The walls crack, the ceiling collapses, and I find myself back in my old apartment. Only now, it's filled with people I once evicted. They stand around, looking at me with contempt, but they're silent. No one says a word, but their eyes say it all. They're not here for revenge. They're here to watch as I fall into the trap I once set for others. I try to escape, but the eerie circle of people surrounds me. They won't let me go. I realize now that I'm a prisoner. I'll remain forever among those I hated, those I evicted. I've become part of my own prison. In despair, I go to the kitchen, trying to distract myself. I open the fridge, but everything inside is rotten. The stench is so foul it makes me gag. Grabbing the nearest chair, I sit down, trying to figure out what to do next. But the chair is hard, and in a fit of madness, I start biting into it as if it were food. Suddenly, I feel something crunch, and sharp pain shoots through my jaw. I'm breaking my teeth on this chair, and only one thought crosses my mind. How did I come to this? Laughter suddenly echoes around me. All these people I once evicted are now laughing at me, savoring the spectacle. I can no longer scream, can't resist. I've become a joke in their eyes. I opened my eyes and froze. Before me was the same street where it all began. The houses stood as they did before, but now they were surrounded by a thick, impenetrable fog. It seemed like the fog was squeezing everything around it, not letting anything pass through or even see what lay beyond. My mind was in chaos. Memories flooded in, crashing together in a wave of madness. But the worst part was that I knew where I was, and I knew this place would never let me go. I remembered everything, every detail, every mistake, every fear. I remembered trying to escape, burning down my apartment, signing the contract in blood. I remembered how each attempt to break free from this nightmare only led to a new cycle of insanity. And now I was here again, the beginning and the end, the same place, the same time. Now I understood there was no way out. All I could do was try to find another path. In the distance, I saw a figure moving. It was the Harrises. They were moving into the house across the street again. As if this nightmare had never ended, I knew I had to warn them. But what could I say? Surely they already knew the truth, didn't they? I approached the Harrises' house as they were unloading their belongings from the car. Their faces were calm, and their eyes glowed with a strange, unnatural light. They noticed me and stopped, as if waiting for me to speak. "You need to leave," I blurted out, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "This place, it's cursed. It keeps us here, won't let us go. I've tried." Mr. Harris smirked and looked at me with a sort of pity, like I was someone who didn't understand something important. "We know, Thomas. We know everything now. But it's not this place that keeps us here. It's you." I froze. His words cut through me like a knife. I was the cause of all this? No, that couldn't be true. I was just trying to protect what was mine. But when I saw their faces, smiling like those strange neighbors I had feared so much, I realized the game had started over. They were no longer the Harrises. They were now part of this cursed place. Every step I took, every word I spoke only brought me back to the beginning. No matter what I did, I kept finding myself here, in the midst of this fog. I realized that the only way out was to destroy everything. If I burned down the entire neighborhood, maybe then the nightmare would end. Maybe then I'd finally be free. I gathered everything that could burn and started setting fires. I wasn't thinking, I was just acting. The houses had to burn. Everything had to disappear so I could break out of this cycle. The flames spread, consuming everything around them, and I felt the fog begin to lift. But the joy was short-lived. Instead of burning, the houses began to melt like wax. The walls turned into a viscous mass that moved and pulsed like a living thing. This mass reached out to me, trying to grab me, to engulf me. I realized this wasn't just a prison. It was something alive, created from my fear, my hatred, my mistakes. I couldn't defeat it, couldn't destroy it. It was part of me. I tried to scream, but a banana flew out of my mouth. I froze in horror, trying to make sense of what was happening, but it was useless. The neighbors, or what had become of them, surrounded me, applauding and laughing as if I were on some kind of show. They watched as I slowly sank into the sticky mass that had once been my apartment. When I was fully submerged in the sludge, everything suddenly changed. I found myself in a courtroom, but instead of judges and lawyers, the same neighbors who had driven me to this point were staring at me. They sat at tables, discussing me like an old case they were tired of. Thomas Randall, the judge began, is charged with arson of his own residence and disturbing the public order. How do you plead? I opened my mouth. But once again, a banana flew out. The courtroom erupted in laughter, and I realized I was forever stuck in this loop of absurdity and madness. No matter what I did, no matter what plan I devised, everything would always return to the beginning. This nightmare was endless.